And just so you know, my dog wanders. I'm in my home office and my dog wanders in and out. And sometimes he snorts or something. So if you hear an animal in the background going kind of, that's my dog. Sorry about that.
Oh, really? Can I see? Can
Yeah,
I see?
sure. Diego. Well, now I decided to wander out of the room. Diego, come back for a sec. Come back. Someone wants to see you. Yes. My you. Come here, buddy. Good boy. Good boy.
Wow.
Yeah, this is Diego Francis Xavier, and he's a
Hello.
French bulldog.
Hello, hello.
Some dogs can see computer screens, but other dogs cannot. And Diego can't see computer screens, so he doesn't usually look or
Uh,
understand there's a person there. But I'm just going to put him down. But yeah, so he might come back in. So if he does, you'll know that's what's making the weird noises in the background.
it's okay. It's so cute.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe at first, please let me introduce me and also my research project
Sure.
briefly.
Hmm.
Mhm. Uh, I'm a third year PhD student at the Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong, and my research interests include globalization and higher education, the
Hmm.
cross-cultural dialogue in higher education, and also the philosophy of education, etc. The topic of today's interview, becoming a fairy person of Chinese and Western wisdoms, is my doctoral research topic, doctoral thesis research topic.
Hmm.
The research aim is to unpack how to become a scholar capable of bridging Chinese and Western wisdoms. So-called fairy scholars in my study are those who possess a profound understanding of diverse knowledge of cultures and also are willing to contribute to cross-cultural intellectual exchanges. And I think Professor Bryan, you are the most important representative of these fairy scholars, especially in Chinese philosophy and Eastern Western comparative philosophy studies. So, um, thank you so much for accepting my interview.
Well,
So,
thank you. It's very kind of you to say that. I'm not sure I'm that important, but I'm happy to help you however I can.
yes, you are.
Thank you.
Okay. Today our interview will include two parts. First is the biographical narrative interview part with your own academic stories sharing, and the second one is the semi-structured interview part with some follow-up questions for you based on my research questions. So, do you have any questions for me or?
No, I'm ready to begin whenever you are.
Okay, so let's start. Um, the first part is could you please share me your past educational and research experiences, particularly regarding how you entered higher education and how you became interested in Chinese philosophy, especially.
Sure. I'm part of the generation that got very interested in China for two major reasons. One was the opening up of China after beginning with Deng Xiaoping and the Gaiga Kaifang 政策. And many people in the US were now very excited about the possibility of economic exchange between the United States and China. And also, for the first time in many years, Westerners were going to study in China, and Chinese people were coming to study and teach in the United States. So that's one thing that got me interested in China. In addition, to be honest, I was also excited about Chinese culture because of the influence of the films of Li Xiaolong, or Bruce Lee as he's known in the English-speaking world. And so I found the Chinese martial arts very exciting. Ironically, I later studied Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but I really didn't study Kung Fu or Wushu. But it did get me interested in Chinese civilization. And I was also in high school doing interscholastic debate. And one of the issues at the time was registration for the draft. So the draft had been ended in the United States with the ending of what we call the Vietnam War. But when I was in high school, they reinstituted registration for the draft. So in interscholastic debate, we were debating whether or not there should be a military draft or conscription in the United States or not. And I realized I didn't have a way of thinking about the relationship between the rights of the individual and the demands of the state. And so I started to read philosophy to learn more about theories of government and theories of ethics. So when I started college, I was interested in philosophy, and my initial plan was to major in philosophy and go on to become an attorney. And of course, in the US system, becoming an attorney is a graduate degree. You get it after you've completed your bachelor's degree. But that was my plan, major in philosophy, go on to graduate school, law school. But I also took courses in Chinese language and culture. And eventually I asked my teachers, where could I learn about Chinese philosophy? And interestingly, my philosophy professor said, we don't think there is any such thing as Chinese philosophy. And some anyway of my sinology professors said, oh, well, philosophy is a silly thing to major in. You should major in a social science like political science or sociology, something like that. But my philosophy professors did say, well, you're very talented at philosophy. Have you considered becoming a college professor and specializing as a philosopher? And so what I did was I combined my two interests and I applied for doctoral programs in philosophy where I could study Chinese philosophy. And at the time, there were only two top philosophy departments where you could study Chinese philosophy, one of which was the University of Michigan, where I could have worked with Donald J. Monroe, and the other was Stanford University, where I did work with David S. Nivison. I was admitted to both programs, and I decided to go to Stanford. And I think that worked out well because at the time, Nivison was on the verge of retiring, but I could work with David S. Nivison. Philip J. Ivanhoe was just completing his doctoral work in religious studies. And Lee H. Yearley in the religious studies department was working on his book, Mencius and Aquinas Theories of Virtue and Conceptions of Courage. So, as it turns out, I was at a place where there was a bunch of people working on Chinese thought. Also, Kwang-Loi Shun, who's now at the University of California at Berkeley, was one of my classmates. And a younger classmate was Edward Ted Slingerland, who's now, I think, at the University of British Columbia. So it was really a great time to be studying at Stanford. So that's how I got my educational background.
Thank you so much for your sharing. Um, I'm wondering, throughout your educational background or your academic journey, are there significant events or turning points that have influenced you mostly in your current research interest or your mode of thinking?
Well, I think that one of the common views that people had in comparative philosophy prior to the time I went to graduate school was that Chinese philosophy and Western philosophy were fundamentally different. Some might even say incommensurable, to use the phrase from Thomas Kuhn. And in the manifesto, sometimes called the New Confucian Manifesto, although the phrase New Confucian does not occur in it. I mean, the manifesto respectfully submitted to the people of the world by Mo Zhongshan, Tang Junyi, Shu Fuguan, and I think Zheng Junmai. I'm probably leaving somebody out, but those are the major names. They present this account of China, or sometimes they say Asia, is having a certain perspective, and then the West as having a different perspective, and these are fundamentally different. So, but when I was in graduate school at Stanford, you had people like David Nivison and Lee Yearly who were arguing that there are actually some interesting similarities between some aspects of Chinese thought and some aspects, particularly of the Aristotelian tradition. And
Yeah.
so, one of the things that was very influential on my approach was thinking of Confucianism as a form of virtue ethics. And again, that was suggested by Lee H. Yearly. The way in which I formulated that was I said, well, you might think of as a virtue ethics as any position that particularly emphasizes a way of life, the
Mm-hmm.
virtues that are needed to live that way of life, how you cultivate those virtues in order to lead that way of life, and then what is human nature like, such that it's possible to cultivate those virtues to lead that way of life. And I say, if a philosophical system emphasizes these four things, we could classify it as a form of virtue ethics. And I said, if you look at it that way, many Western philosophies, including Aristotelianism and Confucianism, although they disagree about what the content is of each of these four things. So, what is a good way of life? What are the cardinal virtues? How do you cultivate them? What is human nature like? They agree in that they're concerned with these four issues. So, I think learning that from my teachers at Stanford, especially Lee Yearly, was a real seminal moment in coming to understand the tradition. In addition, uh, it's more common now, but for a long time, people in the West ignored the commentarial tradition. So they would read, say, the Lunyu or the Zhuangzi or the Tao Te Ching, but they wouldn't know the classic commentaries on these works. But I
Mm-hmm.
came along at a point in history where, largely because of the influence of people in religious studies, people were increasingly translating and reading the commentarial tradition. And I was trained by PJ Ivanhoe, although he was just a senior graduate student at Stanford at the time. He took me under his wing and he taught me how to read the classic commentaries. And it does require some special training because you need to know, like, for example, how is Jushi's commentary laid out? Like, what information is he giving you and how does he give it to you? And so I was trained to do that. And so that's another thing that I knew how to do that many other people coming out of graduate school never learned to do.
Yeah, yeah. I think you are partly you partly answered my next question. Uh Actually I'm wondering, I know that your work actively varies Chinese philosophy or other diverse philosophies into Western academia. Like your work, like your book, Taking Back Philosophy,
Mhm.
a multicultural manifesto, like that. So I'm wondering, what key experiences led you to dedicate your career to bridge these traditions? Are there a moment of shift or
Mhm.
a moment
Uh-huh.
in your own scholarly identity in this process?
Yeah, great question. Um, when I, well, one of the reasons I decided to do graduate work in Chinese philosophy, to be honest, was I thought, well, there are so few people doing Chinese philosophy. I bet I'm guaranteed to get a job when I get out because I'll be one of the very few people who can do Chinese philosophy. And so when I got my degree, I discovered that, well, there are very few job openings for people who do Chinese philosophy. Now, nonetheless, I was optimistic at the beginning of my career and maybe a little naive because I
Mhm.
thought, well, all I have to do is explain to my colleagues how interesting Chinese philosophy is and give them examples of how it can contribute to debates in Western philosophy. And they will be engaged and want to offer courses in that and want to hire people who can teach that. But that didn't happen at all.
Mhm.
And I became convinced that one of the explanations for this was a kind of structural racism where people just take it for granted that no one in outside the tradition that goes back to Plato and Aristotle could have done philosophy. And a really helpful book in this regard was by Peter K.J. Park, and the title is Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy: Racism in the Formation of the Philosophical Canon. And
Mhm.
Professor Park documents the way in which philosophers in the West first received East Asian philosophy and South Asian philosophy with open arms and were took it very seriously and admired it very much. People like Leibniz, who's a standard figure in any history of modern Western philosophy curriculum, said that in fact, in many ways, Chinese philosophy was superior to Western philosophy. But Park demonstrates that due to pseudo-scientific racism and the rise of Western imperialism, people needed a rationalization for why they could dominate militarily and economically exploit East Asia and South Asia. And so the pseudo-scientific racism that said, well, these people aren't even capable of abstract thought provided that kind of rationalization. But that meant that you had to dismiss the philosophy that just a few decades before had been taken very seriously in Western higher education. So
Mhm.
that helped me to understand why I was experiencing all this knee-jerk reaction and why people would say things like, well, I've never read any Chinese philosophy, but I know it doesn't exist. What a crazy thing to say. That requires an explanation for why you think you could say that. And Park helps us to understand that.
Mhm.
So I honestly, for many years, I thought I'm happy that I can teach Chinese philosophy to students, but it's never going to catch on. It's never going to be something that is widely accepted in Western higher education.
Right.
But in the last 10 years or so, I feel like things have changed. And I'm
Mhm.
finding that increasingly that undergraduates are more excited than ever to learn about Chinese philosophy. My younger colleagues in academia, assistant professors and new associate professors, are incorporating Chinese philosophy into their classes.
Mhm.
Even some established professors, older professors, are now increasingly open-minded about the existence of philosophy, not just in East Asia, but South Asia, Africana philosophy, and philosophy of the indigenous Americas. So, in that respect, I'm more optimistic. On the third hand, or maybe by now we're on the fourth hand, I don't know. But on the another thing to keep in mind is right now we're seeing a retraction in higher education in the United States because of the Trump administration. And so schools are dropping departments. Indiana University just dropped a bunch of majors. Other schools are cutting back funding because the federal government is reducing funding. So, in a time of retraction like this, it's hard to convince deans and institutions to hire someone in a new area. So it kind of came at the worst possible time. So we have a weird situation where there's more openness to
Mhm.
philosophy outside the Anglo-European mainstream than there has been before. But at the same time, there's fewer resources. So it's harder to fund positions in these areas.
Right, right. I know that situation. Yeah, yeah. And I know that you have been professor of Chinese philosophy for many years,
Mhm.
and have also been honored as one of the best 300 professors in the U.S. by Princeton Review.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
you also have your YouTube channel called
Mhm.
Chinese Philosophy Class Lectures to
Mhm.
teach Chinese philosophy online. That's interesting, I think. And I'm wondering, in what ways have you personally benefited from teaching Chinese philosophy? And do you think teaching is important to your self-development as a scholar or as a philosopher?
I, these are also great questions. I think it definitely, studying Chinese philosophy has contributed to my personal life. And I think also teaching contributes to my being a scholar. Let me give some quick examples of each. Um, Mengzi has this great line where he says, "The way lies in what is near, but people seek it in what is distant." And I think that's a great saying. And so, what I often tell myself is, because of my experience with Chinese philosophy, I try to be just a little bit better person than I am. So I try to be a little bit more compassionate than I otherwise would be. I try to be a little bit more patient with people than I otherwise would be. And um, I was, I feel like I had great parents who worked very hard to give me a better life than they had and to give me opportunities that they never had. But, they also taught me some bad habits. And so my father was very quick to anger. And so I thought growing up that, well, if you're a man, you should be angry a lot and you should be willing to yell and get into fights with people. But then I said, well, why do I think that? Like the Confucians that I admire, I mean, they would oppose injustice and cruelty when they saw it, but they also like tried to be patient and kind with people when they could be. And so it helped me to accept that it's okay to be
Mhm.
patient and not angry. And that was a lesson I learned from Chinese thought. And also, um, Aristotle, whom I admire very much as a philosopher, Aristotle said the family is basically just a tool for producing more philosophers. So the family is a unit that helps support a philosopher by having people to do household chores for the philosopher and things like that. And also, it just produces children, some of whom might become philosophers. So it's a very limited role for the family. And Plato, of course, famously says that among philosopher kings and queens, they will have their spouses and their children in common. And so the whole family structure would be eliminated for the highest class of people in Plato's ideal society. But Confucians, as we know, say no, just being a good family member is itself contributing to the well being of the state and is itself an exercise of virtue.
Mhm.
So it was helpful when I was helping to raise the twin children that I have, that I had this model that said, I'm not wasting my time raising children. This is part of being a good person, and it's just as important as anything else I do. In American English, I don't know if it's in other dialects of English, but in American English, there's this expression, faculty brats. And a brat is a naughty child. And so the expression faculty brats suggests that children of academics are usually bratty, naughty little children. And of course, that's a stereotype. It's not always true. But I think it's based on the fact that many faculty children, the faculty are busy doing research and teaching, and sometimes they don't, it seems, have time for their own children. And then that leads to children who act out, as we say in American English, because they're not getting attention. So I feel very lucky that our children turned out as wonderfully as they did, and a lot of that is about their character. But it was helpful to me that Confucianism told me you're not wasting your time by spending time with your children. That's a good thing. So that's a way that I benefited as a person from studying Chinese philosophy. I also think in general, if you take teaching seriously, you're always thinking, how can I clearly explain what it is I'm doing? And there's a famous physicist, it might have been Richard Feynman, or it was maybe some other famous physicist like Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, someone like that. Anyway, whoever said it, one of them said, if you cannot explain your theory to your bartender, you don't understand it. So, in other words, if you can't explain your theory to a non-specialist, you don't understand it either. I think that's also good advice in philosophy. So, years of trying to explain in a way that my students could understand what I'm saying
Mm,
helped me, it forced me to understand Chinese philosophy better because I had to make sure, well, if I don't get it, I can't explain it clearly and simply. So
right.
I think it's helped me to understand Chinese philosophy better that I've had to teach it to undergraduates for so many years.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I totally agree what you said. Yeah, that's important. And I know that you have spent a lot of time working in US and also in China, like the University of Wuhan.
Mm,
Uh, what do you think are the differences between doing academic research in these different places?
mm. Yeah, they're subtle. And so I think one difference is that in general, people respect intellectuals more in East Asia than they do in the US. So there's a book by a historian named Hofstadter called
Mhm.
Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And it's really worth reading because Americans just despise intellectuals. And when I tell that to my friends from China, they often say, well, you don't really mean that. And I'm like, oh, no, I mean exactly that. That's exactly that. So part of the appeal of certain politicians like George W. Bush or Donald Trump is they're anti-intellectual and they're clearly not well educated. And I think in my sense is in a place like China, that would be a real factor against a leader if people thought, well, this person's really stupid and illiterate. But in the US, it's like, yeah, they're really stupid and illiterate. They really hate intellectuals. Um, so one difference is I feel more respect for intellectuals in East Asia in general. Um, another uh, difference is, well, there are advantages and disadvantages to both intellectual environments. So I was at a conference many years ago where a couple of different philosophy departments in China got together and they had a big conference. And there were three groups of philosophers at this conference. The philosophers who were doing Anglo-European philosophy, the philosophers who were doing Marxist philosophy, and the philosophers who were doing Chinese philosophy. And most of the time in the conference, the three groups just talked past each other. They didn't really engage each other. They just kind of talked independently. And it felt like some of the people who did Anglo-European philosophy looked down, ironically, on the people doing Chinese philosophy. But it also seemed like the people doing Chinese philosophy were focusing on what I would call philology, which is important, and it's an important part of my work too. And if you don't understand philology, I don't think you can be a serious scholar of Chinese thought. But it's not the only thing you want to talk about when it comes to Chinese philosophy. And so I
Mhm.
felt like their approach was kind of limited.
Yeah,
So in some ways, I think when Chinese philosophy is done at its best, it shows both an awareness of the Western philosophical tradition, the Chinese philosophical tradition, the relevant languages, the commentarial traditions, and the ideal scholar knows all these things and can give a subtle account of how these things are related. And it's rare to find that combination of skills either in China or in the United States or other parts of the Anglo-European world for that matter.
right, right. Yeah. I see. So, I have the next question is like how do you negotiate your dual identity as a Western scholar and also an interpreter of Eastern or Chinese thought? Do you perceive tensions or synergies between these roles?
Yes, well, as I say, I feel like I've learned a lot from Chinese philosophy. And just to give you another example, One of the things I think is really interesting in Chinese thought is the debate between Jushi and Wang Yangming
Hmm.
over the relationship between knowledge and action. So
Yeah.
famously, Wang Yangming says, 知行合一, knowledge and action are blended into one. Whereas, Zhu Xi seems to say, well, action's what's more important, but knowledge comes first. And I think personally, I think Jushi has the most subtle view on this topic and the most subtle explanation of how it's possible to know, in some sense, what the good is, yet not act on what you believe is good. And I've presented what I take to be Jushi's interpretation to Western philosophers. And some of them have said, yeah, I think that's really what Aristotle meant to say. And I say,
Hmm.
well, maybe, but notice we understand, if that's right, that Aristotle's view by finding it more clearly expressed in Jushi. Now, I'm not sure that Aristotle actually anticipated Jushi's view. I think actually Jushi's much more clear than Aristotle on how it's possible to know what is good but not act on it. But be that as it may, I thought that was really interesting that even Aristotle scholars feel like they understand Aristotle better after reading Jushi's explanation of a similar kind of issue. But
Right.
it can get complicated because sometimes it's awkward to be a Westerner who is trying to convince Chinese people that they do not fully understand the tradition that they may identify with. So, for example, I just did a pilot documentary, The Wisdom of China, for China's Central Television. And you can find it on YouTube. It was broadcast once, but you can also find it on YouTube. And it was interesting when we were filming it because I interviewed many Chinese scholars and a number of them said, wouldn't you agree that Lao Tzu is the first major Chinese philosopher? And I had to disappoint each of them by saying, no, I don't think Lao Tzu is the first major Chinese philosopher. I think the Tao Te Ching is a great philosophical work, but I think the Tao Te Ching as a text dates from later in the tradition. And in fact, I think the Tao Te Ching is best understood as a reaction to the Mingjia, the thought of people like Huizi and Gong Songlong. I think if you understand what Gong Songlong means when he says Bai Ma Fei Ma, it's
Hmm.
easier to understand what the Tao Te Ching is saying when it says Dao Ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao, Ming Ke Ming, Fei Chang Ming. So, but that's awkward to be a white guy from, Pennsylvania in China telling Chinese scholars, I think you're wrong about your own tradition on this one point. Of course, some other Chinese scholars said, "Oh yeah, you're right," but blah blah blah, which is fine. But that's a weird thing that will happen to you sometimes, where but there's a line in the Western philosopher W.V.O. Quine, so Willard Van Orman Quine, who wrote about issues in translation. And Quine said that talks about how a someone learning a language starts out not knowing any of the words. And he said, but if you learn the language well enough, you can
Hmm.
argue with the native like a brother. You can argue with the native like a brother. And that's kind of an inspiring idea. And so that's the way I aspire to do it is to say, look, I'm thinking about Confucianism as an insider. And as two insiders, you and I are arguing about how to understand the tradition we're a part of. And that's okay because people in the Confucian tradition, Mengzi disagrees with Xunzi and Zhu Xi disagrees with Wang Yangming and Dai Zhen disagrees with both of them. So that's okay. It's all right to be part of the tradition and disagree with other people in it.
Right, right. I really like your like explanation of the insider of the
Mhm.
Chinese philosophy. I'm also wondering, in your opinion, what are the advantages and disadvantages of an international scholar studying Chinese culture compared with a Chinese local scholar?
Yeah. I, I think one disadvantage is there's a temptation to think that the international scholar to be quicker to think that the international scholar doesn't really get it. Like, well, but they're an outsider. They would get it if they were Chinese. Um, and again, that's not fair. But I could imagine, suppose you're a Chinese scholar of Homer, and you read classical Greek, and you're very familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey. You might have a reading of the Odyssey that might be different from some Western scholars. But at the end of the day, they might be inclined to discount you. But the fact that you're a Chinese scholar studying Homer doesn't tell you anything about the validity of your view. Same thing if you're a Western scholar studying Confucius, you could be right about it. But sometimes people, I think, are a little tempted to say, well, you don't really get it. You're not one of us, whatever that means. On the other hand, there are sometimes advantages because you can see things from a very fresh perspective. And so you're not limited to the perspectives that you were taught. And it's worth keeping in mind that the perspectives you're taught as a graduate student today are not necessarily going to be the same as the perspectives that people had in ancient China or in the Sung dynasty. And so people who are themselves Chinese and native speakers of Putonghua still have to learn what people said and thought in the Song dynasty, or what people said and thought in the Zhangguo Shiqi. And so that's still a process of projecting your mind and achieving what Gadamer called a fusion of horizons between your perspective and that of the authors of the original texts. So, it's worth noting all of us have to do that. You're not a contemporary Chinese person speaking Putonghua is not a person in the Zhangguo Shiqi speaking, Wenyan.
Oh, yeah. The Gadamer's view about the fusion of horizon also important in my study because I think that's how these fairy scholars know and understand diverse worlds or diverse wisdoms, diverse cultural systems. Yeah, that's important.
Yeah.
Uh, I want to ask a general question to you. Like, how do you usually conduct your research? Like, how do you usually choose a research topic based on your personal interest or something else? And who is your target audience when you write articles or papers?
Ah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fortunate in that I tend to come up with a lot of ideas. And so as a child, it just turned out there were not many children in the neighborhood I was raised in. And so there were not many kids to play with. And so I got really good at inventing stories in my head to entertain myself. And so I would just invent these elaborate stories, and I might not even be doing much besides just walking around my backyard, but I'd be thinking of this elaborate story and this elaborate world I'd made up. And as a result, I developed a really good imagination. It's surprising, I think, how important that is in scholarship. And I think a lot of people either have trouble coming up with good research topics because they lack a lot of imagination, or when they try to research another civilization, they have trouble thinking their way into the perspective of the people in that world because they just lack the imagination to do it. So I just have a lot more research topics than I can write on. And sometimes I'll decide to write on a topic just because a friend asked me to do it. And so there's a paper I'm kind of proud of talking about theories of translation in Donald Davidson and Willard Quine, whom I just mentioned a minute ago. And Davidson was actually Quine's student. And so a colleague of mine, Dilip Menon, in he's originally from India, but he's currently a scholar working in South Africa. He asked me to contribute to an anthology he wrote. And because he's a friend of mine, I thought, oh, I should help him out. And I thought, well, what am I going to write about? And I said, oh, you know what? Uh, I've been thinking about the work of Davidson and Quine on translation for years, but I've never written an article on it. Why don't I write about that? And so that I
Mhm.
was really proud of how that turned out as an article. And again, that was just kind of an accident. I just happened to be, if he invited me to write something, and it was something that was inspired by some other writings. And I looked at those writings, they mentioned translation, and I thought, oh, yeah, I could write on Quine and Davidson on translation. That'd be great. Another example is for many years at Vassar, I've taught a course, Introduction to Chinese and Japanese Literature. And I'm not trained as a literature scholar, I'm trained as a philosopher. I have literally no training in how to teach literature, but I had to teach it because Vassar needed me to teach it. So I read a lot of literature for this, and a friend said, I'm editing this anthology on Chinese literature, and I'd love it if you could contribute something. And I said, well, I don't know, I really like Lu Xun. And so maybe I could write something about Lu Xun. And I ended up publishing, particularly on Lu Xun's Kuangrun Erji, which I think is a really great work of literature. And it turned out, for example, for writing that article, Lu Xun in Kuangrun Erji, the narrator refers a lot to the moon. And I wondered, I said, does Lu Xun know about the Western tradition that the moon inspires lunacy, madness? And in fact, as you may know, the English word lunacy, meaning madness, is related to lunar, meaning moon, because there was a belief that the moon drives people insane. And so I said, how would I figure out if he knew that? So I looked at Lu Xun's publications and I realized he had translated Jules Verne's novel From the Earth to the Moon. And I said, is there a reference in that work to lunacy? And so I went and I read From the Earth to the Moon. Sure enough, one of the chapters mentions, well, the moon is supposed to drive people insane. And so I was able to establish that Lu Xun did know for sure the Western folklore about the moon. And so I said, this is part of what's going on in the story. He's appealing to both the Buddhist image and also Neo-Confucian image of the moon as a symbol of enlightenment, but also the European tradition that the moon produces madness in people. And the narrator of Kwangrun Urji is both insane, but also insightful about the society that he's in. And so all of that was just an accident of what I was teaching and a friend saying, I'd really appreciate it if you'd contribute to this anthology. And I'm like, well, what can I write about? Well, I guess Lu Xun, he's pretty cool. So that's a lot of my research, to be honest, it's like that. And then my audience, in this case, for the Lu Xun piece, it was very introductory because it was for an introductory anthology. For the Quine and Davidson piece, my audience is anyone interested in translation, but I also hope to send a message to people in mainstream philosophy, many of whom take Quine and Davidson very seriously, because I wanted to point out the limitations of the translation theories of Quine and Davidson, and in particular, the ways that their theories of translation, I think, have helped discourage many Western philosophers from learning foreign languages. So it used to be standard in American doctoral programs that you had to learn at least one foreign language and sometimes two. Usually it would be one of French, German, Latin, or Greek. Um, but But now almost no doctoral programs in the United States require any foreign languages. And I think part of that, as I argue in this article, I think the title is just, I should know the title of my own article. It's like Quine and Davidson on translation, the challenge from the global south. But I argue that Davidson's theory of translation has convinced mistakenly many philosophers that there's no need to learn any languages besides English. And I try to explain why I think that's a mistake and why Davidson's argument does not show that you do not need to learn foreign languages.
Hmm. Hmm. I know. Yeah. Thank you so much for your sharing. And
Sure.
also I also want to know like which collaborators or research groups do you primarily interact with? Like mostly Western scholars,
Mhm.
or you also collaborated with some Chinese scholars?
Mhm. Well, the Vassar is an American style liberal arts college. And
Mhm.
as you may know, I know you're in education, liberal arts colleges are a kind of weirdly unique American development that occurred because of an intersection of a bunch of different trends in American civilization. But a liberal arts college doesn't have a graduate program. So I have no graduate students at Vassar. Um, and liberal arts colleges tend to be smaller than the larger universities. So I have very few colleagues who work in any area similar to my own. My colleague, Pepe Cho, who's just retiring from the Chinese and Japanese department at Vassar, some of her research interests and mine overlap. She's written about, for example, the influence of Zhuangzi on the great Japanese haiku poet Matsuo Basho. And she's currently working on a translation of the Zhuangzi in the light of a particular Japanese commentary on it. So we overlap a little bit. But I actually have few colleagues at Vassar who work in my area. I have colleagues at other institutions whom I have worked with and I continue to correspond with. So some of the people I go to if I have a question or I need feedback on an article include Justin Tewald, who's now at the University of Hong Kong, um, PJ Ivanhoe at Georgetown, Aaron Klein also at Georgetown, Eric Hutton at the University of Utah, Eric Harris, who I believe is at the University of Colorado. Um, but those are some of my first go-to people that if I have a question, I have a feeling like they'll probably know the answer. So we don't have a formal research group. In China, one of my favorite among my favorite colleagues are Robin, well, actually Robin Wong now, I guess in the United States. She's still at Loyola Marymount, right?
I also interviewed her,
I
Robin.
thought so. Yeah. So is she at Loyola Marymount? Yeah, I thought so. Yeah. But I know she has a lot of connections in China, so I kind of thought of her in connection with China. But also my colleague Li Yong, who's at Wuhan Dashue, very smart, very articulate interlocutor, and I learn a lot from talking with him.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Um, uh, let's go back to your book.
Sure.
I also mentioned the book Taking Back
Yes.
Philosophy
Hmm.
Manifesto. You published that book in 2017.
Hmm.
Uh, and this book, I know that this book and some related articles have caused great controversy in
Hmm.
academia. Yeah, many years have passed. And do you think the situation of what you called less commonly taught philosophies has improved? And how should the multicultural philosophy be further realized?
Yeah. I think that in many ways the situation of the less commonly taught philosophies, including East Asian, South Asian, Africana, and Indigenous American philosophies, I think open-mindedness about the existence of these philosophical traditions and the value of the philosophy in these traditions, people have become more open-minded about it. And so it's much less common to find people simply denying the existence of philosophy in these traditions, much less people denying the existence of philosophy in these traditions and admitting they haven't read anything, which I did used to encounter quite a lot. So I think that's the good news. As I say, the bad news is we're seeing a real retraction or retrenchment in higher education in the US. And so trying to get departments to hire people in these areas is harder than ever. Um, in a way, it still shouldn't be because you always have to make choices about what you're teaching. And there are plenty of philosophy departments that have multiple specialists in, say, the Western philosophy of language and don't have a single specialist in Chinese philosophy or Indian philosophy. But as a matter of strategy, it's harder to make the case in a time when universities have to cut back. Now, it'll be interesting to see where we're going in the future. One theory is that we're looking at in the United States with the rise of far-right movements is what is sometimes called extinction surge. And this is a term from biology. Extinction surge refers to the phenomenon where a kind of behavior is on the way out. But ironically, when a kind of behavior becomes maladaptive, there's a tendency of organisms to suddenly try to use that behavior a lot. And the one analogy people use is if you've ever tried to use an ATM card and it doesn't work, well, what do all of us do? If your ATM card doesn't work, you're like, what? And you just try to like keep like this is going to make a difference. I do it too. It's like, oh no, why isn't this working? Um, and so they say, well, that's what this far right movement is. It's on the way out, but there's a tendency of it to like lash out in the last burst of the behavior. Fingers crossed, that's right. And I heard another US presidential historian on television say this is how US politics works. It swings first to one extreme, and then when it swings back, it doesn't swing back to the middle, it swings all the way back in the other direction. And so we have a far right movement now. The backlash is going to be a far left movement. And we just saw an avowed socialist get elected. Well, not ele I shouldn't say elected mayor of New York. He just won the Democratic primary. But if you win the Democratic primary in New York, you're in good position to win the primary election later, the main election later. So, yeah, so maybe that'll happen. But in general, far right movements tend to be fairly anti-intellectual. So, as long as we have a far right movement in the United States, it will probably be a period of increasing retraction and, you know, not expansion of higher education, and that will be bad for the teaching of things outside the mainstream.
Mm, yeah. And I know that you were recently the host of a documentary. You also mentioned
Oh, yes.
uh, China Central Television CCTV, The Wisdom of China 老子中国智慧老子篇.
对对
Yeah,
对.
I also watched that program, and I
Oh,
think brilliant program that
oh, you're
uh
very kind. I worked with very good producer, cinematographer, editor, a lot of very talented people. So I think a lot of that credit goes to them.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. And I'm also interested in the term wisdom.
Mm,
As you know, I focus on individual scholar in my study, and so I use the term wisdom also at the core of focus in my study because I think for scholars, not only their knowledge, but also the way of their wisdom, like the way of thinking, their life philosophies, their values and their worldviews are also important. So, as a philosopher, how do you define wisdom?
mhm.
What aspects does it encompass?
Yes. Well, so one way of thinking about it is, at least at certain points in his career, Plato thought that basically virtue is a kind of knowledge. And So, one way he thought you might cultivate virtue was by doing things like studying mathematics, including geometry. And there
Mhm.
was a sense that it's the same kind of intellectual activity that's going to be good at understanding geometry that will be good at understanding what justice is or acting rightly in practical situations. One of the insights that I think Aristotle had was that there's a difference between what we might call intelligence and what we might call practical wisdom, what Aristotle called phronesis. And so this helps us to understand why, for example, there were brilliant scientists and physicians who worked for the Nazis during World War II. And if you try to say something like one of my favorite examples is Werner von Braun, who was the genius behind the German V1 and V2 rocket programs. The V1 and V2 rockets were way ahead of their time technologically. And at the end of World War II, von Braun surrendered to I'm sorry, he surrendered to the Americans as opposed to surrendering to the Russians. And he later became a leading figure at NASA. And the fact that the US was the first nation to put people on the moon is probably largely due to Werner von Braun. Now, at the same time, Werner von Braun, we now know, was very much aware that the underground rocket factories that he was supervising were using slave labor. And we actually have documentation of him writing and saying, you got to send me more slave laborers because they're dying so fast. Like many of them are dying every day. So you got to send me more slave laborers. That's a war crime, right?
Mhm.
So, but if you want to say, oh, well, Werner von Braun's just stupid. No, he's not stupid. He's in fact a genius in intelligence. What he lacks is practical wisdom. And practical wisdom manifests itself in things like I mean, I'll use examples from Mengzi, things like the unwillingness to accept a bribe, right? So Mengzi says in one of my favorite passages in the eponymous Mengzi that if you try to give a beggar a handout with contempt, they'll refuse it. Like, well, who do you think you are? But if you offer someone a bribe of 10,000 bushels of grain, they're like, oh, yes, sir. Oh, I'll do anything. I'll say anything you want. And so the implication is that part of practical wisdom is that it's just as shameful to accept a big bribe. In fact, arguably worse, because if you're on the edge of starvation and you refuse a handout given with contempt, that's hard. But if you're already doing okay and someone offers you a huge bribe, what do you need the bribe for? You need a mansion. You already have a house. What do you need a mansion for? So, or another example, famous from Mengzi is anyone who sees a child suddenly about to fall into a well will have a feeling of alarming compassion. But if we don't extend those feelings to other situations, if we don't realize, well, you should show the same compassion for, a homeless person, or you should be willing to pay taxes to help people who are too sick to care for themselves, that's a failure of practical wisdom. So I think practical wisdom is this ability to do things like, and I think the Confucians emphasize things like practical wisdom is being a good judge of the character of others, so you can size other people up pretty quickly. You don't have to be perfect at it. Confucius admitted that he said, sometimes I misjudge people. Yan Hui was my best disciple. I thought he was stupid because he never asked any questions and I was a dummy. And he also says, it's Rancho. It's Rancho. He says, I thought he was a good guy, but then when I looked at what he actually did, it turns out, no, he doesn't act on what he says. He doesn't follow his own words. But in general, a wise person is a good judge of the character of others. A wise person is also a good judge of means and deliberation. So, how do you get things done in a practical way? And third, a person with practical wisdom knows what is right and wrong and sticks to that. They actually follow through and they do the right thing. So, a trivial example is many years ago, I was at a lunch event hosted by the Asian Studies program at Vassar. And right at the end, our administrator had to leave, and then she came back in a few minutes later and she said, "I'm so sorry, my tire's flat. I don't know how to change a tire. Can anybody help me change the tire?" And I was there with about a dozen scholars, and I was still eating my food. So I said, "Well, somebody else will take care of it." And I noticed the room was silent, and so I looked up, and nobody's hand went up, and I said, "Well, I know how to change a tire." And my colleagues were like, "You know how to change a tire?" I'm like, "Of course I know how to change. Do none of you know how to change a tire?" And it turned out I was the only person in a room of academics, all of whom had high intelligence, but none of them knew how to change a tire. So again, that's a fairly minor exercise of wisdom, but I think that is the kind of thing, if you're wise, you can just handle practical situations. You know how to get your way through them. That does not mean you're perfect or you don't make mistakes, but you know how to handle things like that.
Yes, I think you're right. The practical wisdom is really important.
Mm.
And how would you define Chinese wisdom and Western wisdom? Are there similarities or differences between these two?
Yeah, I think that the way Confucians at least use the term "zhi" uh, in Wenyan, I think is very similar to the way Aristotle used phronesis. And so I
Mm,
really think they're quite similar. And I think one of the reasons people sometimes do not recognize the similarity between the Chinese jurt and the Aristotelian phronesis is they're thinking in a Platonic terms of wisdom as being the same as intelligence. And a Confucian sage, well, like think about this, that Einstein is kind of a pop culture figure and pop culture hero in the West. And
mm,
Einstein's a great physicist, but he also shows up in movies and TV shows. Um, and usually 90% of the time, Einstein is presented in a positive light. Now, I don't have anything against Einstein, but what did he do that was so great? Well, he's just really brilliant physicist, and people admire that about him. Um, and I think that's good. There are a lot worse things in life than admiring brilliant physicists, but the Confucian ideal of wisdom is, I think, less like that Platonic ideal, where we're
mm.
just really, really smart and very intelligent. And it's more like, well, are you good at handling practical situations? Can you actually solve practical problems? So I think there's a lot of overlap there. Um, I think, uh, there are subtle differences. But for example, one my friend and colleague Edward Ted Slingerland points out that although we tend to associate the term wu, which we sometimes render in English as non-action, with Taoist, and it certainly does incur in Taoist works, we do find the term and the concept in Confucian works. And so wu is found in the Lunyu, the Analects, which give the sayings of Confucius and his immediate disciples. And Taoism and Confucianism, as Edward Slingerland points out, have in common this feature that they both think the highest kind of virtue should be spontaneous. So you should just spontaneously do the right thing without having to think about it. Now, that's certainly different from some Western conceptions of virtue. Certainly, Kant would say that when you do the right thing, you have to do it out of awareness that you're following an inviolable moral principle, an application of the categorical imperative. So that you have to be invoking your rationality in order to be doing the right thing. But again, in many virtue ethics traditions, people will stress if if I find someone's wallet, ideally it shouldn't occur to me to keep the money. It shouldn't be that I think, oh, gee, I could keep the money. well, let me weigh up, keep the money, return to the guy. That shouldn't, it should be like, oh gosh, this person must be so upset. They don't have their credit cards, they don't have their ID, they don't have their money. How can I find them? That should be your immediate reaction. And so if you look at it in more depth, we don't call that wu in the Western tradition, but the ideal is that virtue should be spontaneous. And when it's obvious what the right thing to do is, you shouldn't have to think about it for too long.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's interesting.
Mm.
And do you perceive Chinese wisdom and Western wisdom as complementary or conflicting or something else? Do you think should Chinese and Western wisdoms be integrated? And how can this integration be achieved?
Yeah. I think well, what I would say in general is that the Western, there's not a Western tradition, there are Western traditions with an S. And there's not a Chinese tradition, there are Chinese traditions with an S. I think there are aspects of particularly the Confucian tradition that goes back to Mengzi for thinking about jur that are very, very similar to what I would think is a correct understanding of Aristotle's notion of phronesis. But, people read Aristotle in different ways, and there are ways of reading Aristotle that are very different from what I would think is the Confucian understanding of wisdom. But then there's also, like, as I say, there's a Kantian understanding of what it is to be a virtuous person. And there's a Stoic understanding of what it is to be a virtuous person that in some way influences Kant's understanding. So, and then also like a Buddhist conception of wisdom will be different in important ways from either a Confucian or an Aristotelian one. But I think there are ways of understanding wisdom in China and ways of understanding wisdom in Western traditions that are very similar. But you can learn a lot by focusing on either way that they're presented. A lot of times, I think, for example, in reading Aristotle, he gives you a very helpful theoretical abstract account of, for example, how wisdom differs from other mental virtues and other virtues of character. And that can be useful. On the other hand, Confucian texts will often give you lots of practical examples that you can then think about that will help illustrate those distinctions and help you to understand them better. So, in that respect, I think, for example, Aristotelian and Confucian ways of talking about the virtues are complementary.
Yeah, yeah. And we always mention the Chinese, the Western. If I talk about Chinese and Western or Chinese wisdom and Western wisdom, people may say that your idea are too binary. It's kind of
Hmm.
so what do you think about that?
I think that's a genuine concern. And so what I say with my students is I may occasionally give you oversimplifications to try to help you organize your beginning thoughts. But at the end of the day, what we want to find is what my teacher, Lee Yearly, referred to as similarities in differences and differences in similarities. And what Lee meant by that was he said sometimes you'll see something that looks similar in, say, a Chinese text and a Anglo-European text, but when you look at it more carefully, you realize, oh, this actually is quite different. Um, on the other hand, sometimes you look at things that seem very, very different, and then when you look at them more carefully, you realize, oh, there are actually some deep underlying similarities here. So, um, for example, I've seen people translate E as as righteousness, but I've also seen them translate E as justice. I see why you might translate E as justice, but I think that's a case where there's differences in similarities. At a certain level, again, to use the wallet example, if I find someone's wallet that they've dropped or left behind, if I give it back to them, at one level, that could be an act of E or it could be an act of justice. So you might say, oh, there's a similarity there. True, but for example, I think for Mengzi, the reason you should give the wallet back is both because it would be shameful to keep someone else's money, but
Mm-hmm.
also it would be a failure of compassion because you should. I mean, honestly, it's very rare I find someone's wallet, but if I do, my first reaction is that person must be going crazy. Because if I lost my wallet, I would just think, oh no, this is a disaster. The money is the least part of it. You're just like, I got to cancel all my credit cards. I got to get a new license. This is going to be a disaster. And so I would be thinking, oh, that's why I got to get this wallet back to them. And Mungs would say, that's okay. It's both, you know. And so and then justice as it's understood by, say, for example, let's just make it easy on ourselves, a Platonist isn't really it should, according to Plato and Aristotle, justice should not be motivated by a sense of shame. But
Mm-hmm.
for Mengzi, a sense of shame, you know, 羞恶之心, that's central to the virtue of righteousness. Now, I also think Mengzi's analysis is more insightful than Aristotle's on this topic, but that's another issue. That's but like that's just an example where, oh, so righteous justice and righteousness, those are the same. Well, they're similar, but when you dig down, they get different. And then on the other hand, you know, like I say, things like acrasia or weakness of will, failing to do what you know is right, it looks like, oh, we don't find that concept in the Chinese tradition. But when you look more carefully, you realize, oh, that's what Juxi and Wang Yangming, it's one of the things they're debating about. They don't have the same term for it we do, but it's clear that this issue of whether Zhixing He, that's really related to the issue of akrasia or weakness of will, even though the notion of will is a
Mm-hmm.
distinctively Western notion that was
Sorry,
actually, yeah, go ahead.
sorry,
That's all right.
you. It's knocking my door. I'll
Go ahead, answer your door, no problem. No problem.
that. Sorry.
No problem. I went to get some water while you were doing that, so it worked out.
Let's go ahead. Sorry.
No, no, that's okay. We were just talking about, so we said an example where there might be differences and similarities would be that returning a wallet looks like it's both an example of and justice. But when you probe further, there are interesting differences between how these respective concepts work. And then I was saying in the other direction, differences or similarities in differences. The first example I gave was Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming talking about what we would call weakness of will or akrasia in the Western tradition, even though the standard term in English for failing to do what you know is right is weakness of will, which appeals to this distinctive notion of will, which was really first emphasized by St. Augustine. So it looks like that's a really different concept, but then when you look at what Juxi and Wang Yangming are doing, you realize, oh, they're really debating the same issue that's motivating Plato and Aristotle to talk about akrasia.
Yeah. Yeah. So you think it's worth to integrate these two with different wisdoms, or it's already integrated?
I I think you learn a lot and it deepens your understanding by looking at the subtle differences between the traditions. And
Mhm.
so you are going to find some things that are interestingly different. So some examples would be it is true and I think Angus Graham was the first to really emphasize this, that the fact that the Indo-European languages have forms of the verb to be, leads
Mhm.
to a very distinctive discourse on being in Western philosophy from the earliest times up through the contemporary world. But uh, despite that, there are just all these interesting similarities on other topics. It's also true that Confucians are very interested in the notion of rites, rites, or rituals, like Lijun. Uh,
Mhm.
and you don't find quite a discussion of that in Western philosophy, although you do find discussions of the ways of the distinction between nomos and physis. But I wouldn't say that's exactly the distinction between, that Confucians are marking by talking about ritual. So there are some genuine differences, and I think it's helpful to think about the differences that we find in each tradition because of this. But I feel like I've learned so much and I understand Western philosophy even much more deeply because I've thought about the similarities and differences between Western and Chinese philosophy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You have discussed a lot of topics about virtues, moral issues,
Mm.
and also have mentioned that you have learned a lot from learning Chinese philosophy. I'm wondering, have you experienced any personal or intellectual transformations while studying Chinese philosophy, like how to solve people, the perspectives of the world, and how to treat people, and so on? Yeah, I think you have already mentioned a little bit like how to raise your children, like how to, well, yeah. Can you give me more examples?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I think it's interesting to think about the way that both Western philosophy and Chinese philosophy categorizes different kinds of people. So
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite passages in the Mengzi is the story of the Shengyuan. In English, we sometimes translate that as village worthy. It's hard to translate it, but that's one thing we'll sometimes use. And Mengzi it's based on a passage in the Lunyu that's very brief. And Mengzi expands on it a lot and claims that, and I'm going to simplify a little bit here, but Kungzi supposedly said, some people are kind of squeamish and other people are kind of overly exuberant. And the overly exuberant people, are always agitating for being more virtuous and following the way of the ancients. But sometimes in their own personal behavior, they don't live up to their own ideals. And then you have the squeamish people, they're kind of quiet, but they're the sort of people who would never do the wrong thing. And so they're not going to be very loud or in advocating for the way, but they're not going to do the wrong thing either. And Kungsa says, you know what? I'd rather have somebody who exactly hits the Tao, the way. But failing that, I'm happy to work with people who are overly exuberant. I'm happy to work with people who are overly squeamish. The one person I want to just walk past my door and never talk to me is the Shangyuan. And in describing them, he says like the world set can find nothing wrong with them. And so the person talking to Moses says, well, so what's wrong with them if nobody finds anything wrong with them? And my interpretation of the passage is, well, they're just really morally complacent. The idea is, I'm good by the standards of contemporary society, and that's good enough. That's all I
Yeah,
have to be. I don't have to aspire to anything else. And so
yeah.
I think it's fun to ask ourselves, who are we? Are we the squeamish? Are we the exuberant? Or are we the complacent village worthy who's just like, as long as nobody's really mad at me, that's good enough. And what would that person be like at civilizations and various points in history? So
Mhm.
who would you want to have as your friend, at various points in history? And I think, yeah, I mean, the either the exuberant or the squeamish person would be the one that you'd want, to be your friend, not the village worthy, because they'll just agree with whatever low standard society sets. So I think in a way it's kind of deepened my understanding of other people to think about what are they like in Confucian terms? So what are their strengths and weaknesses? Or it's also fun to think when you get to know Confucius's disciples better, you start to get a very vivid sense of what they're like. And so I think Zulu in many ways is a fun character because he's just, in a way, he's one of these exuberant people. He's just like so headstrong and, he's always like, leaping, as we say in at least American English, he leaps before he looks. He leaps before he looks. So he just like go in and like, well, you should have looked at where you were going before you jumped in there. Um, and then on the other hand, you've got people like Rancho who, talk a good game, but then they just say, oh, I can't succeed. It's too hard. And Confucius says, it's too hard because you decided it was too hard. You decided it was too hard for you. So I think it really gives us a very deep understanding of other humans that we interact with and allows us to better deal with them if we understand the kinds of people there are in the world.
Mhm. And how do Chinese wisdom or ideas influence your research method or academic perspectives,
Hmm.
such as research paradigm, research
Mhm.
content, methodology, etc.?
Well, that's a good question. I think I'd say there's there's a way in which I think the style of research I do is in some ways modeled on, Cao Zhengxue, in the later Chinese tradition. And so, but I think in many ways that the later tradition draws on earlier traditions. So, for example, um, when I read like the Si Shu Ji Zhu by Zhu Xi, it's clear he's really thinking in a very systematic and evidential way about the meaning of the texts. And I don't always agree with his interpretation, but there's always a reason why he's got the interpretation that he does. He's thought about the meaning of the text, and he's particularly motivated to show the consistency between the Si Shu. I mean, ultimately, he thinks there's a consistency between the Wu Jing and the Si Shu, but I think he's particularly motivated by saying, no, the Si Shu, this is the same Tao, just
Mhm.
transmitted in four different styles by four different authors. And that's an interesting project. It's not my project because I think that the four books, may have very well have different perspectives. And I think they were written at different periods in Chinese history. But it's really interesting to see him argue for his interpretations. And so I think that's what we should aspire to is you want to be able to defend why you read a particular text in a certain way. And I'll just say, you didn't directly ask me this, but let me just volunteer this. One concern I have about the field now is I think a lot of people who are working on Chinese thought have not taken the time to understand the historical development of Chinese ideas. And what I mean by that is I'm reading a lot of papers now and I'm refereeing for journals or just things people are sending to me. And I'm finding that people will read a Chinese work and then they'll kind of rip it out of context and
Mm.
they'll try to think of some contemporary Western work that reminds them of what they're seeing in the Chinese work, and then they project that Western interpretation onto the text. Now,
Mhm.
we mentioned Gadamer earlier. One of the things that Gadamer makes clear is there's no way to read a text without bringing presuppositions to the text. So it's not a criticism of somebody's work if you say, oh, well, you're reading this in the light of presuppositions. Of course I am. Thinking that we're reading a text as opposed to meaningless scribbles on a piece of paper is a presupposition. So you have to bring presuppositions, but what you need to do is always be asking yourself, okay, here's my tentative reading. Are there any problems that the text presents for my reading? And you have to expand your reading to include the intellectual context of the text you're reading. So, who is the text responding to? How did later people respond to that text? Because that tells you something about how they understood it. And I'm worried that many, work, a lot of work I'm seeing now, people aren't taking those extra steps. They're just landing on the first thing. Oh, this sounds to me like contemporary pragmatism. Well, American pragmatism developed in response to certain trends in the Anglo-European tradition. And if those trends don't exist, you're not going to expect to find pragmatism in the Chinese tradition. Now, again, maybe you can tell a story about how pragmatism might have developed independently, but you have to tell that story. You can't just say, "Oh, it isn't that funny? This, Confucian figure from the Ming Dynasty happens to look exactly like a 20th century Western philosopher." Maybe, but that's going to be a little surprising, and you have to convince us how why we should believe that.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, I also want to ask you how would you balance the interpretation of traditional Chinese ideas with modern philosophical frameworks, as you mentioned? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it's got to be I think one helpful idea, again, from Gadamer is the hermeneutic circle between the reader and the text. So what you're always doing is you have to bring presuppositions to the text, but
Yeah.
then you also always have to be reading and rereading to understand better the limitations of the framework you've brought. And so for example, um, when I first started reading Confucian texts, I thought, oh, okay, they say he's a master, but that really just means teacher, right? So he's a teacher, he's a Laosher. And as a starting hypothesis, that's okay. But as I continued to read the Analects, I realized, you know what? Any contemporary college teacher would be in a lot of trouble if they talked to their students the way Kongzi talks to his Dizi. And I said, so you know what? I don't have the right concept here. He is a master, and that means in part that he's taken responsibility for the ethical cultivation of his students, but that means that they've entrusted him with responsibility for their ethical development. And so that means that it's going to be appropriate for him to talk to them in ways that it would not be appropriate for me as a contemporary college professor to talk to my students. So I never do things, for example, I like speculate about why a student isn't doing well. I might ask them. I might say, I've noticed that your attendance hasn't been very good. Is there anything you want to talk about? Um, but I wouldn't. I can imagine Confucius saying something like, "Look, you say you're tired. You're making excuses. You're just lazy." I might think that. I might think, I'm hearing a bunch of excuses. I've heard them before, but it's not my place to call a student out on that. But Confucius would say something like, "You're lying. This is BS." He wouldn't say BS. He'd be classier than that. But he'd say something like, "This is nonsense. You're just being lazy." Um, and or to give you another example, for many years, the final paper assignment in my Neo-Confucianism course, um, I would say, what would Wang Yangming say is your gong fu, your personal spiritual task? And it was interesting. Some students would just write very formulaic, like, well, I should try harder and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, B, whatever. But occasionally, students would be very revealing of deep personal problems and trauma that they're wrestling with. And I eventually stopped assigning the paper because I said, I'm not qualified to deal with the problem students are bringing to me. I don't object to them voluntarily bringing them to me, but I feel like I've put us both in an awkward position by inviting them to talk about deep personal issues that I am not trained to address. And I just feel like it's putting me in an impossible situation. Now, again, I can imagine teachers saying, well, that was cowardice on your part. You should step up to that. But I think in a current academic environment, it's also important to have boundaries between yourself and students. And I would never, reject a student who said, I have a problem I want to talk about. I am trained, I took special training in how to refer students to people who can help them when they say I've got a substance abuse issue or I'm feeling suicidal or whatever. I feel I've been sexually harassed, but it's mainly okay, I will get you to a person who can help you with this problem. I'm not it. And so I felt like I can't put myself in a position where I'm basically encouraging students to tell me things I can't help them with. Although I do also tell them, of course, if you have a problem and you're not trying to handle it, you can always bring it to me. But I didn't want to put myself in the position of the Z. I'm not Wan Z. I'm not Master Wan. I'm just, Wan Lao Sure. That's all I am.
Okay. And besides being a philosopher, you are also an excellent translator.
Oh,
You
thank you.
have published your book like Reading in Classical Chinese Philosophy based on your translation work. And there are often some obscure and difficult concepts in Chinese philosophical viewpoints. And how did you do the translation from China to English without losing their original meanings?
Yeah, that's another great question. Again, I think it's important to figure out who is the audience for your translation. And so especially for readings in classical Chinese philosophy, we were looking for a reader that would be suitable for introductory students reading Chinese philosophy for the first time. And so sometimes it's okay to, I think, simplify a little bit for the purposes of readability, um, even if it leaves out some of the nuances, if this is going to be the first time people are encountering these texts. So, on the other hand, sometimes I think, and one of the reasons we did, Ivanhoe and I did readings in classical Chinese philosophy, is we thought that, many earlier translations of these texts were inadequate in some fundamental way. So, for example, um, this is I'll give you a controversial example. Mengzi talks about, in the passage where he talks about the child at the well, he also talks about the Duan. And we, in readings in classical Chinese philosophy, render Duan as sprouts. Now, Ju Shi renders the same term Duan as a tip or endpoint. And technically speaking, the character that occurs in the Mengzi normally means the tip or endpoint, like the tip on a line segment would be a Duan. And Jushi thinks, well, that's what it means in this passage. That's plausible, but most of the time, when Mengzi gives metaphors for our innate but incipient virtuous inclinations, he uses agricultural metaphors. In other passages, evidently talking about the same reactions, he refers to them as like meng or miao, or other terms that are synonymous with sprout. And the right hand side of the character Dwan is a pictogram of a sprout breaking through the earth. So our guess is that originally what Mengzi had written was the right hand part of the character, which meant was another term for sprout. And then in beginning in the Qin and in the following Han Dynasty, when they standardized the characters, that character for Sprout is very rare. And so they said, oh, it has this on the side. It must be that. And so they standardized it. Um, and so that's the kind of complicated issue where and some Chinese translators follow that as well. They'll actually, I've seen some Chinese translations will also, translation into Baihua, is what I mean, will render it also as sprout. And so I think that's the correct meaning based on the fact that Mengzi does not tend to use geometrical metaphors like, oh, it's like the tip. He likes agricultural metaphors. It's like a little sprout that's growing. So, but we think that's an improvement over other translations. Another tiny example is D.C. Lau, who is one of the best translators there ever was. So I'm not, casting any aspersions on the great D.C. Lau. I hope to be as great a translator as D.C. Lau was. But in his translation of Mengzi 1A7, at least in the original translation of it, he says, the king was sitting up in his hall and someone led an ox through the lower part of the hall. And my teacher, David S. Nivison, wrote this great article on translating Mencius, and he said, why would anybody be leading an ox through a royal hall? Why would you do that? And he said what DC Lau is missing, and it's funny because it's one of those weird things where Nivison, the white guy who was born in Maine and taught at Stanford, realized this, and DC Lau, the Chinese guy, didn't get it, is if you remember how the halls are laid out in the Forbidden City in Beijing, you have these halls that are raised above the ground and there are stairs leading up to them, and they look out into a courtyard below. So, what the original classical Chinese means is the king was up in the hall and he saw someone leading an ox below the hall. So, it's not the lower part of the hall, it's below the hall. So, and again, we got that right. And in the original Penguin Books translation, DC Lau got that wrong. So there are some things that you just get better is like, well, we think this is a better interpretation, or we think this is more accurate to what we know about, for example, the architecture of the era. And in general, what we tried to do is give a very readable translation, um, even if that occasionally meant, well, we've left out some of the nuances. If we think those nuances are really important, we footnoted them. But mainly we wanted something that people could pick up, be a first year undergraduate, read it and say, yeah, I think I understand that. I get the basic idea.
Yeah, yeah. And throughout your academic experiences, what difficulties or challenges have you encountered when conducting research on Chinese philosophy or integrating Chinese and Western wisdoms?
Um, I'd say that again, it's less common today, but over the course of my career, there have been moments where, people have been very dismissive of Chinese philosophy. So, for example, um, I won't say who it was, but I was talking to a leading Western epistemologist when I was a graduate student at Stanford. And he, read one of my essays in which I said, um, I gave the example. I said, well, Confucians think it's important to cultivate virtue. One of the critiques that Taoists will raise is that the effort to cultivate virtue is self-undermining. Because if you consciously aim at virtue, you're going to end up being a hypocrite rather than genuinely virtuous. And I think that's actually a deep point. And so, one thing I tell my students is think of how many people you know of in US politics who talk about family values or the importance of virtue or the importance of religion. And it turns out they've been married 4 times and, they cheated on all their wives and they embezzled money, from their church and, all these things. And Taoists would say, see, that's what happens when you try to self-consciously aim at virtue. You just become a hypocrite. And one of the ways that Tao Te Ching expresses this is by saying people who talk about ritual, as soon as, how does it go? As soon as you disagree with them, they roll up their sleeves and they resort to force. And so this leading epistemologist at Vassar said, "Yeah, I thought your paper was really interesting." I said, "Oh, good, good. What did you find most interesting?" He said, "Did those guys have sleeves? Because every picture I see, they're wearing gowns." And I'm like, "Well, gowns can have sleeves." He's like, "Huh, how about that?" That was it. That was his question about Chinese philosophy. Uh, a leading epistemologist. Another time, an ethician was talking about the centrality of compassion in
Mhm.
Hume's ethics. Um, an ethician was talking about the centrality of compassion in Hume's ethics. And I said, yeah, that's really interesting because Mengzi also emphasizes the centrality of compassion in his ethics. And she just started to laugh, like, and again, it was like, and the way I read the laughter was, it's like I brought up something like Winnie the Pooh. It's like I just brought up something completely silly that no one could take seriously. And it's like, but and you wouldn't if you'd said something like, well, actually, that's surprisingly similar to X philosopher who's a Western philosopher. Anybody would say, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. Oh, Hume's
Mhm.
view is very similar to Adam Smith's view, which actually is true. No one would have laughed. They would have said, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know there was that similarity between Adam Smith and Hume. But you bring up Mung's like, oh, that's so cute. It's so funny. You think that's relevant. So those are some examples of some of the more egregious, cases I've dealt with.
It's kind of external biases that you have received. Yeah, and what's your idea about the current phenomenon of Western centrism in
Mhm.
global philosophical research? I think you have already mentioned many times in your work and also in your narrative.
Yeah, I think that yeah, the US is in such a weird situation right now. Um, as I say, I think that there's much more openness toward the less commonly taught philosophies today in academia, but there's also a very xenophobic and nationalistic trend in American politics.
Mm,
And whether or not this is going to be, as I hope, a short-term anomaly that, the pendulum will swing back in the other direction. And if anything, we're going to have a much more progressive government, or is this the future now? To
mm,
quote George Orwell's 1984, he's, one point, um, the guy torturing Winston Smith says, O'Brien, I guess it is torturing Winston Smith and says, imagine a boot on the face of humanity for the rest of time. Is that what the future will be? I don't know. I hope not. But I do feel like there is more positive attitude and a more accepting attitude towards, for example, Chinese philosophy than there has been in the past, at least among most academics.
mm. Yeah, I see. You have emphasized many times, like Chinese philosophy do exist, and Chinese philosophy is a philosophy.
Mhm.
But sometimes many scholars that I interviewed earlier said that most global scholars follow more Western academic
Mhm.
paradigms, knowledge systems, and that Chinese academic paradigms do not even exist. What do you think about that kind of view?
Yeah, I mean, I can only go on my own impressions. I I do think sometimes you get this weird situation where, for example, to look at the new culture and the May 4th movements in China, the Chinese intellectuals, the vast majority of them said traditional Chinese thought is the problem. And we've got to overcome that and instead learn Western philosophy. But even that was complicated. I have a colleague writing a dissertation on Husserl at the moment. And Husserl is an interesting case. In many ways, he's very critical of traditional Chinese thought, but he's also he also did groundbreaking research on the history of Chinese philosophy and help people to appreciate the value of Chinese novels and vernacular literature. So he didn't just want to turn his back on the entire Chinese tradition. And actually, I did some research. I published this first in my book, Virtue Ethics and Consequentialism in Early Chinese Philosophy. Um, Hu Shi really emphasized the role of philosophy of language in understanding Chinese thought. And he interpreted Zhengming, we render that as the correcting names or rectification of terms. He emphasized this in Confucianism. And although not that many people in the West read Hu Shi's work, his work was read by Feng Youlan. And Feng Youlan, his book, A History of Chinese Philosophy, was translated into English by Dirk Body, and it became the best-selling history of Chinese philosophy in the Western world for decades. It appears to me that my own Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy is now the best-selling history of early Chinese philosophy. But for many years, that was Feng Youlan. And Feng Youlan followed Hu Shi in emphasizing the importance of the philosophy of language in Chinese thought. And ironically, because Westerners wanted an authentic Chinese interpretation of Chinese thought, they read Feng Youlan's history. But Feng Youlan's history is influenced by Hu Shi's history, and Hu Shi's history is influenced by the Western analytic philosophy that he learned studying in the US. So people got a Western influenced interpretation of Chinese philosophy by reading Feng Youlan. And that, like, when I was growing up, the way that Feng Youlan framed Chinese philosophy, which was influenced by Hu Shi, was really dominant in Western academia. But I was really excited when I figured that out, and I published that in Virtue Ethics and Consequentialism in Early Chinese Philosophy, because you could see how this weird way in which Western ideas filtered through Hu Shi and Feng Youlan had influenced not just Chinese thinkers, but Western thinkers who were trying to learn about Chinese philosophy from Chinese people.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Um, I'm wondering, what are your expectations for future research between Chinese and Western philosophies, and what do you want to contribute in your future studies in this field?
Yeah, I'm working on a book. I've been working on it for a long time. I this is probably the time when I should really hunker down and get it done. But I want to synthesize some aspects of Aristotelian and Confucian ethics. And
Mm,
so um, I've published on this a little bit in some earlier works, but for example, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle gives what is sometimes called the function argument for what it is to live well for a human. And the function argument assumes that we live in a teleological universe, a universe where everything is ordered by a higher power to a certain telos, goal, and purpose. And Aristotle argues the only plausible goal, end, or purpose that is distinctive of human beings is the use of the rational part of our mind. He does say that, but that asks people to buy into a lot. It's a lot to ask contemporary intellectuals to believe that we live in a teleologically structured universe. I'm not saying it's impossible. Maybe it's true. I have smart friends who believe we live in a teleological universe, but it's a lot as a starting point for a theory. But what people often miss is that right after that, Aristotle says, well, and also there are a limited number of goals that humans could reasonably be aiming for. So, for example, some people seem to aim for wealth, some people aim for honor, other people aim to be of service to their community. And Aristotle gives this interesting argument, and he says, well, wealth is only useful as a means, right? If you, of course, you want wealth because you don't want to starve, you don't want to be cold, you want to be able to help your friends. But those are just means, which wealth is a means. Those are things that are wealth is a means towards. What you really want is to be well fed. Wealth is a means to that. You want to have a roof over your head. Wealth is a means to that. So wealth is not intrinsically a goal of your life. And honor, he said, yeah, you want honor, but if you say you want honor, I'm going to ask you honor for what? So honor isn't a complete goal. You got to specify honor for what. Um, and then Aristotle says, so we're left with service to the community. Now, Thomas Aquinas takes that structure and he expands it with more options. And so Aquinas says, well, what if somebody says, I want power? In addition, or instead of wealth, they say, I want power. And then Aquinas distinguishes between something like notoriety and honor. And he says, some people seem like they want just to be well known. But again, if you think about it, well, which do you really want? Do you want to be well known or do you want to be well known for being good at something? And if you want to be well known for being good at something, okay, good at what? And then Aquinas narrows down the list into a handful of things that people might plausibly want to be good at. Um, and the among the things that survive as plausible goals of life are service to the community, love of God or a higher power, a life of creating or appreciating art, um, and what am I leaving out? Community, service to God. Life of theoretical understanding, like being a physicist or a mathematician. Um, and so it's plausible to say that if you're asking, how should I lead my life? There are only a limited number of answers that will be plausible. And this actually gives you some concrete advice about how to lead your life. And then I think that part of the program is largely Aristotelian or Thomistic, influenced by Thomas Aquinas. But then it seems to me if we now say, okay, that's what we should be aiming at, one of these ways of life. What virtues do we need to lead that way of life? I think we need run e leisure. And I think that's a better list than either the list Plato gives or the list that Aristotle gives. And how do you cultivate those virtues? Well, guess what? The Confucian tradition gives you this elaborate account of how you cultivate virtues. And what does human nature have to be like to make sense out of these pictures? Again, the Confucian tradition, both in Mengzi and I think also in later thinkers like Zhu Xi, gives you a sense of what human nature is like that explains why things like service to the community could be worthwhile goals for a human being. So that's
Yeah.
my next big project is to write a book where I do all this. It's an ambitious project, but I have to just sit down and do it. So that's one of the things I want to do going forward.
I hope to see your more excellent work in the future.
Thank you.
Mhm. And let's go to the final part of my interview question.
Okay.
Related to the research title of my study, like the fairy scholar. How do you perceive and understand the concept of being a fairy person between Chinese and Western wisdom? How would you define the term fairy scholar, and what are the attributes of a fairy scholar in your perspective?
Well, that's a really intriguing concept that you developed. If we think about it that way, um, I often, when I'm teaching in China, I'll often teach about what I call Anglo-Confucian ethics. And
Mm.
so I'll talk about or Anglo-Confucian political theory, really. So, what are some of the things that are distinctive of Confucian political philosophy? But then also, what are some of the things that are distinctive about, Western political philosophy? And I also end up explaining a lot of details about contemporary American politics. And so sometimes, for example, my students will ask me things like, explain to me, why there are so many guns in American culture and why people are so committed to owning guns. And so I've actually taught courses about firearms in the US, so I can explain that. Or explain to me what do you think is distinctive about, the Trump movement and the Trumpers in the United States? Um, and so I can explain details that my students might have missed. But on the other hand, I also ferry back knowledge, to Westerners. And so, one thing, just one example, I often say that an important difference between China and the West is that the religious wars that occurred in Europe, um, and also the religious conflicts in the history of the United States, led Westerners to say, look, we just have to tolerate other people's religions, even if we think they're crazy, because the alternative is we kill each other. And after years of bloody religious wars in Europe and in Northern Ireland, and religious conflict in the United States, people just said, enough. We're going to tolerate your religion no matter how crazy we might think it is. In contrast, I think really seminal for Chinese understandings of religion was the Taiping Rebellion. And I think people said, well, you know what? We had this weird religious movement, the Taiping, and 20 million people died. And so we don't need a replay of that. So the Chinese lesson was don't tolerate strange fringe religious movements because it leads to conflict. But as a result, Americans are just baffled that there's not absolute, uncontaminated freedom of religion in China. And it seems like, oh, how can you violate people's innate right to practice whatever religion they want? And people in China are like, why would we allow crazy religious movements, that won't allow people to get, I'm just explaining the Chinese perspective, won't allow people to get blood transfusions, or you're not going to let your kid get vaccinated, or you're gonna think that this weird guy is the new messiah. Why should we allow anybody to do these things? Last time we tried that, tens of millions of people died. So that's the kind of thing when I explain it to a Western audience, their eyes kind of go, oh wow, I get it. That's a really different perspective on it. I've also taken to explaining to my students, a lot of people in the US have no idea what the issue is involving Taiwan and mainland China. And I'm going to just express it in the most, neutral way I possibly can. But it's just like they just don't even know what the issue is. And so I say, look, you decide what you think about this issue, but here's the background. Here's how US policy has changed over time. Here's what happened when Nixon went to China. And here's what the Shanghai Communique says about this. And here's what our policy has been. And so, again, most Americans don't have any idea what the background is here. And so I can be a fairy person in your sense, I think, say, well, look, here's, what people tell me, about this, and here's what I know about the objective history of events and what happened in terms of foreign policy and history. And here's what mainland China will say about this, and here's what the US policy is about this. So that kind of cross-cultural running back and forth and saying, you said this, they said this, I think can be a very useful process.
Yeah, yeah. So from your stories, you do consider yourself as a very scholar between Chinese and Western wisdoms, right?
Yeah,
And
I hadn't you thought of that term before, but now that you've introduced it to me, I like that term, and I'm comfortable having myself described as a fairy scholar. Um, yeah, I'm gonna I'll think about the term, but I like the concept. I'm just thinking that is that the best term we can come up with, but I like the concept. I like the concept of envisioning, someone going back and forth. So I between the two cultures. So I think that's a good concept.
do you think the metaphor of fairy scholar is suitable or?
Here's the only reason I'm pausing, and I could be totally wrong about this. When I first said, I was going over before our talk, I was going over your email and I said, okay, blah, 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 blah. And I told my wife, I said, oh, she's interested in the concept of a fairy scholar. And she heard it as Fairy. And she
Know
said,
that.
a what? And I said, no, 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 fairy, Ferry. So that's the only reason I'm pausing at all is that my wife, who's an attorney, so she's quite smart and literate, her was like, fairy, like a fairy? Like, I don't get it. And so, but I'm wondering, Karen in Greek mythology was the ferry the person who drove the ferry over the river Styx. So maybe uh, like a Karanian, like some play on Karen, Karanian
Mm.
scholar. But maybe we're the only people who are going to have that reaction. Like I say, when I told my wife, her reaction was like fairy. And so, like, no, 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 Ferry scholar. So that's the only reason. But I like the concept. I'm just wondering, is there a different way to express it so that English speakers like me won't be like, yeah, fairy? Like, if you hear it, when you see it written out, you know immediately what it means. But when you hear
Yeah.
fairy scholar, it sounds a little weird in English, and there's no way in English to mark the different there because they're homonyms. So
Yeah.
Airy and Ferry are perfect homonyms in American English. So, but I don't know. But
And
again, maybe I'm overthinking it. I'm just giving you that's the only reservation I have is like, oh, geez, that maybe that people are going to mishear it. So, but again, I could be totally off base on that. So if nobody else brings it up, don't worry about it.
and pardon me, what's the other word you mentioned? Common,
Oh,
like
Karen? Oh, yeah. So I can send it to you in the chat. I think the spelling is correct. So, but double check. Was the uh creature that uh took buried people over the river Styx in Greek?
Mm. Okay.
But I could be way off base on that. Just like it does, it's the to the ear. It's when you see it written out, it's clear. Oh, fairy scholar, yeah, like ferrying back and forth. And I was
Yeah.
trying to think, oh, is there a way of putting it in a different way? So, but again, maybe I'm the only person who had that reaction. So don't worry about it too much.
Actually, I have interviewed Professor Roger Ames at first,
Uh,
and he also mentioned that term fairy, Fairy, to me.
okay, so
So
maybe it is a thing for native English speakers. We're just going to be like, that sounds it's and again, I don't want to be crass, but fairy is also a term. It's a slang term in English for tongxing aija.
yeah, yeah, like
Yeah,
good.
and again, that's very crass. But when you hear it, you're like, what? It sounds so I don't know what to tell you. It's just I don't know. You could also say like I'll think about it. I'll think about it. I'll see if I can. But the concept I love, but it's just maybe there's a better way to use the term.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
And and since you first approached the Chinese wisdom to now, do you think your academic identity as fairy person or something else has undergone some changes?
Um, let's see. I think I've yeah, probably when I started out studying Chinese philosophy, I think my goal was more as a pure, so to speak, a pure philosopher, that I was just interested in philosophical understanding of the concepts. And that's a way of doing philosophy that is very influential in the contemporary United States. Like, well, you're just a theoretician. Um, and uh, I kind of wanted to do that. And so, in a way, I've been driven more in the direction of being a fairy scholar, and also to some extent a political figure by having to think about why are people not receptive to Chinese philosophy. And so I kind of like, for example, I wasn't that interested in the problem of racism. I was opposed to racism, but I didn't think I was going to be the kind of scholar who says, well, structural racism is the reason why Chinese philosophy is not more broadly studied in the US. But I really think structural racism is the reason Chinese philosophy is not more broadly studied in the United States. But I didn't start out to be that kind of scholar. I still like I just want to have a theoretical understanding of it and explain it to other people. But I got more and more involved in political issues and cross-cultural exchanges as my career advanced because of the ideas I was developing. So
Mm,
that's a change that I didn't expect, but that came along.
right. And maybe the last interview question,
Okay.
like what aspects of education or training do you think young scholars need to receive if we want to cultivate more scholars like you who can bridge Chinese and Western wisdoms?
I think that you really need to mentor
Mm,
students in graduate school for them to develop the right kind of understanding. And that
mm,
requires both a willingness on the part of the student to be mentored, but
mm,
also a willingness on the part of the faculty member to mentor the students. So again, I owe a great debt, and many scholars in the field owe a great debt to Philip J. Ivanhoe because he has been a great mentor to many younger scholars. And that involves things like you just need someone to sit down with you and read classical Chinese text and at least one of the major commentaries, and you just talk your way through it. And the
mhm,
things that come up as you do that, um, you'll learn a lot about not just the language, but also about philosophy. And
mm,
so, for example, again, I just teach undergraduates, which I'm honored to do, and it's a great experience, and I've learned a lot from it. But occasionally, I'll teach a course on the Analects of Confucius in English.
mhm,
And what we'll do is just discuss one book of the Analects per class meeting. And so you might, so, the first class, you might discuss, Shue'er, that section of the Analects. And I'll just say, okay, what was a passage you don't think you understood? Or if students are being a little quiet today, I might say, well, let's just start with the first passage, Shue'er, Shi, Shi, Zhi, Bu, Yi, Yue, Hu, uh, Abu Ilahu. And uh, then we'll talk about what might you misunderstand about this passage, or what, what, for example, what is learning here? What does
mm,
learning mean? Is what you're doing at Vass or Shui as Kongza understood it? I said, I don't think it is. And so that's the first thing that's going to kind of throw you. And then we'll talk about different interpretations of Shi, Shi, Zhi, because different commentators will read that in different ways. And so just things like that, going through a text really, and I'm doing this in English translation, so we're not even doing it in the original Chinese. But with graduate students, if you do that in the original Chinese, and you go over the primary text and at least one major commentary, say maybe Ju Shi's commentary, you're going to learn so much, and you can tie it into issues in Western philosophy and
mhm,
different ways of understanding a text and different interpretive theories. And you can learn so much by doing that. But as I say, that requires a student who has the willingness to be mentored. They have to be, a term we often use in graduate school is somebody teachable? And not
mm,
everybody's teachable. Some people just like don't want to learn, or they don't want to learn from you or whatever. And on the other hand, is the teacher willing to devote the time to just sit down and mentor somebody one on one? I think that's what people really require. And you need to learn the classical Chinese language. You need to learn
mhm,
the language of the text that you're studying, but you also need the distinctive commentarial language of the commentarial tradition, depending on whatever era the commentarial tradition was written in. Might be Han Dynasty, might be Sung Dynasty, might be Qing Dynasty, whatever you're reading. You need to have a good knowledge of Western philosophy. Why? Because Western philosophy is kind of the lingua franca, the common language for philosophy in the world today. Like it or not, that's the way it is. You just have to learn it. But then you also have to learn the historical development of the Chinese tradition. So there's a lot to absorb. And only, I think, through a kind of mentoring experience can you really get that. So that's what I think we really need, but it's very rare to get that today.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for your sharing. I
Mm.
think that's all my interview questions. And thank you so much again. I have really learned a lot from your insightful ideas and also your excellent academic experiences. Thank you so much. And do you have any questions or comments to me?
No, thank you. I appreciate very much your questions, and I'm glad I've been able to be somewhat helpful in your research.
Oh,
And thank you for this opportunity to talk with you.
yeah, and I hope that you also enjoyed our conversation.
I did very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and all the support for my research. And one little request is
Hmm,
could you please recommend me some more global scholars in humanities and social sciences
hmm,
who
hmm,
are excellent very persons of Chinese and Western wisdoms? Like I'm doing the snowballing
hmm.
into researching.
I think some of the people that I talk to that I mentioned as like people I go to are helpful. You've already talked to Robin Wong. Um, uh, you might, if he's interested in talking to you, you might talk to Philip Ivanhoe at Georgetown University. Um, Another person to talk to, actually, Justin Tewald at the University of Hong Kong, I think is a great scholar. Um, uh, Aaron Stallnaker at Indiana University is very good. Edward Slingerland at the University of British Columbia. Eric Hutton at the University of Utah. Eric Harris, I believe it's either University of Colorado or Colorado State. He's very good. Erin Klein at Georgetown University. She's very good. If you contact any of them, you might mention that I recommended them. That'll just, not that I'm that important, but it'll just be like, oh, okay, you're a friend of Brian's. So it might make it more likely. They're all busy, but they might be more inclined to do it if you mention, oh, Brian recommended you to me.
Great. Thank you. And if you can and you can recommend me more, you can mention it from the email or
Okay.
something. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll send you the recording link after our interview from
Okay.
the yeah, and that's all the interview content. I think thank you so much
All right.
for
Thank
your
you.
support.
Okay.
And
I'll,
all right, yeah, it's so late.
it's
Thank
okay.
you.
No problem. No problem. All right,
Yeah, you
I'll let you and close the room just so I don't do anything accidentally by closing it.
okay. So good evening, good night, and
All right.
have a nice night. Bye bye.
Bye bye for now.
Bye bye.